To those that don't know me, my name is John Watts. I am a post-processing specialist for photographers. You take the perfect shot and I'll help you get the absolute most out of it. And I can help you in three ways. One is with Photoshop products and services, high-end digital printing, and the third is with color management products and services. So a little bit about me. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time. I'd rather spend time on your images. Basically, it's like, well, why should I listen to you? Well, as you can see, I've been doing this for a while. I started out surfing in the 1 hour lab craze in 1979 through 1983. And you can see that back in the day, I used to have hair. Now I don't have any hair, but that's okay. I certainly have more knowledge, which is much more important, of course. Watts Color Lab, that's where I became self-employed in 1984. And we basically all we did was type our prints from slides, type our prints and enlargements. It was custom printing from slides and transparencies. In 2001, basically went all digital. The analog process that you saw on the previous page was basically discontinued. The whole industry went through an upheaval starting in the mid 90s through the early 2000s, where we went from an analog to a digital product. This is the LightJet line right here. These are the LightJet printers. They print with light instead of ink. So it's a sensitimetric product. It's actually in a darkroom, as you can see. On the other side of that darkroom is a paper processor, again, with developer bleach fix and all that. These are some examples of the various prints. I do a lot of public speaking, a lot of judging of photo contests, including the San Diego County Fair and Orange County Fair photo exhibitions, both of them. Of course, they're not happening this year, so we're doing these instead because it's fun. So how best to learn Photoshop through these meetups? Well, first of all, you can attend all 5 Photoshop 101 meetups, even if they're not sequentially. One of the things that I like to strongly suggest is that you get into some homework. And I know that sometimes it's like, well, I'm too old for that. Well, the only thing that's going to get you better at Photoshop is you spend about an hour per week at your computer with Photoshop and some other things that we've covered. And after a while, you're going to find that 1 hour turns into 2 hours and you start discovering stuff and you're going, wow, this is pretty cool. So there are some videos that are linked in the notes. Speaking of links, you'll notice that on the very first page of the notes, there are a whole bunch of links that are discussed. I would encourage you to go through that for your homework, particularly the ones that are more applicable to what we're going to talk about tonight. As always, if you have any questions, please contact me. Some optional things that do cost money. You can buy my Photoshop book. There's a link for that on that links page. It's available on Amazon, and portions of what you see tonight are portions of the book. I also will have some small group workshop meetups, layer mask, master file creation, etc. Those will be very specialized with a limited number of people. We're waiting for the COVID-19 thing to shake out before we actually rock and roll with those, but eventually we will. I also I offer any print and color management products and services that you may want, as well as private instruction if that's something that you're interested in. A couple things that I didn't mention is I do want to thank you for spending some time tonight with us. I think hopefully you'll get a lot out of this. Also, if you have any questions at all, please use the built-in chat. I will check that on a regular basis. Let's see, I will be working on a Mac. So if there's a Mac versus a PC issue, I will let you know. It's going to be rare, just so you know. The functionality between the Mac version of Photoshop and a PC version of Photoshop, there really aren't any differences other than the speed keys themselves. So there's also kind of a 20-80 rule when we're dealing with a subject like this, where you're going to remember 10 or 20% of it, and you're going to forget the other 80% of it. Hopefully, the other 80% is either in the notes, or if you cannot find them and you got a question that's not in the notes, please feel free to email me. A couple of things about how I teach. You can think of my teaching method or philosophy as being analogous to a manual transmission in a car versus an automatic transmission. And a manual transmission is mechanically simple, give you tons of control and higher performance over your automobile. I mean, they don't use automatic transmissions in NASCAR or Formula One after all. There's a reason they use a manual transmission, but it does come with a price. There's a learning curve when you're first starting to drive a manual transmission car. And after a time, you're fine using a manual transmission becomes instinctive, and you don't even think about stalling the car anymore. In fact, I keep an old early 90s Ford Explorer 4x4 5-speed around just because I love to drive a manual. So once a week or two, I'll just take that thing out and me and that car, we have some fun. So there's nothing wrong with an automatic transmission. It's just kind of blah for your results. And we really want to get more out of your images. You took a lot of time and a lot of trouble and blood, sweat, and tears to get those images. Let's not get to the point where you go, okay, well, I'll just do kind of a half-assed job on my post-processing. And you really don't want to do that. So what I'm going to show you in Photoshop is the same way. It's simple, like the three things say. It's simple, tons of control, and high performance. I drive a Ford Taurus, so I can use this analogy. It's the difference between a Ford Taurus and a Ferrari 308 GTS, for instance. Taurus will get you there, but a Ferrari is going to get you there with a heck of a lot more performance. You also notice that one of the things I said was simple, and I should point out that simple and easy are two different things. There is a difference. Nothing good in life to me is easy. So example, if you're digging a hole in the dirt, that's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. So what I'm going to show you is simple in concept, but not necessarily easy. So just kind of keep that in mind. Priscilla said that 80% is in the homework on learning this program. And you know what? I think you're right. So I would definitely encourage you, and you'll hear me mention that quite a few times about doing homework. So let's go ahead and go to the notes. I'm going to start on page 2. We're going to talk about a master file concept just a little bit. What you're seeing on the screen and what you see on page 2 is a visual representation of a proper workflow in Photoshop for photographers. By the way, I don't know if anybody has my book, but if you'd rather follow in the book instead of my notes, the notes are page 2, but in the book, and I'll mention this as we go along, I'll be in page 7. So what I want to show you is this visual representation of a proper workflow. Notice that your workflow centers around on creating a master file, which is right in here. And by the way, I also have a linear workflow chart available, either from it's in the front section of my book, or from the free useful downloads link that you can find on the very first page here. Down near the bottom, you can download a linear flow chart. If it's not something you're familiar with, by all means, hang around in 2 weeks on June 24th, because we will be doing master file creation and workflow working from that checklist, the linear checklist. This is just, like I said, is just a visual representation of that. And in fact, all we're really going to cover tonight is what you see here in the upper left-hand corner, opening Camera Raw first and then Photoshop. What is a master file? Again, I'm on page 2, page 7 in the book. Creating a master file is not for every image. It's for those images that you want to spend time with, doing all that's necessary to make your image pretty. And we covered that in the last 30 minutes of the last, was class 5 last week, editing for success. I rarely bring every image into Photoshop. In fact, I don't bring every image into Photoshop. I only bring those images into Photoshop that I want to create a master file for. And this is where you're going to pour your artistic blood, sweat, and tears into your image. What is a master file? There's a definition on page 2. It's a 16-bit unflattened, unsharpened, uncropped, unresized file designated as such in its file name. If some of that doesn't make any sense, hang around here and you'll eventually know what all that means. Why create a master file? There's 3 reasons here. It's multi-purpose. You can use it to create separate files for a specific print size or printer for the web, magazine output, and so on. And you'll stay consistent between those files. Because when you look at this chart, the left-hand side of this this visual representation, I guess is a better way of putting it, is where you do your creative work. The right-hand side is where you do your procedural work. Other than cropping, cropping can be very creative, but the fact of the matter is it's all centered on the master file. So if you're entering, let's say you're entering the San Diego County Fair, which is a 2-tier contest, first of all, you create your master file. And for tier 1, you're going to create it, and you can see over here, save to size, email, and web, and you would send that in to the judges for tier 1. If you make it past tier 2, which is about 1 out of 3 images, you come back to your master file and print it, save it for print output, which of course is different than your web output. So that being the case, your creative mojo, all your blood, sweat, and tears you want to pour into your master file. And it starts with what we're going to talk about tonight, working with your raw file. The second reason why you create a master file, it's easily correctable for color, contrast, cropping, enhancements, and so on in a non-destructive manner. In other words, loss of digital information or throwing pixels out. And I should also mention that sharpening is applied to your print, your final print. In other words, you don't never sharpen your master file. Because if you do, and let's say it's a typical master file that's 12 by 18 at 300 ppi, but yet you only need an 8 by 10 of that. If you sharpen your 12 by 18, I'm sorry, if you sharpen your master file at 12 by 18 and then make an 8 by 10, your 8 by 10 is over sharpened. So that's why sharpening is done after the fact and the procedural stuff on the right-hand side. Okay, a couple things I want to cover here before we go any further on RAW is that those that know me, I'm not the biggest proponent of Lightroom for the most part. So let me talk about Photoshop versus Lightroom. I get this question, asked this question over and over. For working on my image, should I use Lightroom or Photoshop? And to me, that's the wrong question. Perhaps not even a fair question. Photoshop and Lightroom are not designed to replace each other, as it says right here. They are designed to complement each other. They're two different programs with two different purposes. So what are the right questions? And this is not in your notes, by the way, but if you go to those posts that I talked about, you can read all of this, and I would highly encourage you, if you are using Lightroom, that you go to that before you decide how much further you want to take using Lightroom. So what are the right questions then, if that's not the wrong question? For enhancing my image and getting the highest quality output from my digital capture, which is the better program? Answer: Photoshop. And for critically culling, condensing, editing, rating, and managing my rather large collection of images, and I emphasize large, which is the better program? Answer: Lightroom. So here's another way of thinking about it. And like it says on the PowerPoint, you can think of Photoshop digital darkroom, whereas Lightroom is a digital library. Now, is there crossover between the two programs? Yeah, where the confusion comes from. For instance, Bridge comes free with Photoshop and is a very good file browser. In fact, that's what I use and have for decades. And Lightroom has a develop and print module to emulate certain Photoshop image enhancement functions, but you should never confuse what you can do in Bridge with the robust organizational power of Lightroom, nor should you even remotely confuse the develop module in Lightroom to the full capabilities of image enhancement capable in Photoshop. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to let you guys go and spend time with those Photoshop versus Lightroom wrong question part 1 and 2. And there are 3 choices available. I use number 2, just so you know, if you want, when you get to it. If you're a newbie at this, I recommend you start with Photoshop and Bridge, using Bridge as your file browser, then Lightroom later if you need it. There are 2 reasons I'm not a big fan of Lightroom. Number 1, I believe that a lot of photographers who use Lightroom are not using the develop module properly for the highest quality output, either thinking that it's the end all in post-processing for best printing results, and it most definitely is not, or that it's Photoshop Light or beginner Photoshop, or that by just moving a few sliders willy-nilly, they could make their image look great, quote unquote and unquote, because that's really kind of subjective, I suppose. And generally, everything I've told you couldn't be further from the truth. I also believe that number 2 is also a more program than most people need for browsing, cataloging, and labeling your digital files. Plus, it has its own separate and sometimes complex learning curve. If you don't need the organizational power of Lightroom, why learn a second complex program? If you do need the organizational power of Lightroom and are going to use it in your overall Photoshop workflow, then let's look at the next slide here. Key point here, and everybody needs to know this: the Lightroom develop module and the Adobe Camera Raw plugin, I'm just going to call it ACR, by the way, from here on out. The Lightroom develop module and the ACR plugin, accessed through Photoshop and Bridge, are virtually the same. They should both be ultimately utilized with the same goals in mind. We're going to talk about those goals in just a few minutes. So if you're going, what's this goals thing? You'll see, and I think it'll make more sense. So if you are using Lightroom, you got 2 possible procedures. One is to use the Lightroom develop module as though you were going to use the Adobe Camera Raw plugin by following those goals that we're going to talk about. So procedure number 1, you stay in Lightroom and use Lightroom develop module, not to get the best image, but to follow those goals. You bring it into Photoshop to finish it up, and then back to your Lightroom library. The second procedure, if you're going to have Lightroom in your workflow, is Lightroom library, but instead bring it into Adobe Camera Raw via Photoshop, then into Photoshop, and then back into your Lightroom library. I give reasons in part number 2 of Photoshop versus Lightroom wrong question on why I believe number 2 is the better way to go if you insist on having Lightroom in your workflow. I suggest that you use Lightroom for only its organizational power and do not use it at all for any kind of adjustments to your image. Bottom line, pick one procedure that I've mentioned here and stick with it for procedural consistency. Again, I would suggest that you go to part 2 of that Photoshop versus Lightroom post, and you'll see a lot more about what I'm talking about. If you're not using Lightroom like me or other folks that I know, then you don't need to worry about it. This is just for those that need Lightroom in their workflow, and not everybody does. All I'm going to do tonight, and I'm glad I went back to this slide. You see what's in the red box? That's all I'm going to do tonight. In fact, you can substitute right here where it says Lightroom Library. You can put the word bridge in there for me. And the same over here, bridge, because I do not use Lightroom. I choose not to because of the sheer simplicity of bridge. And hey, I go through hundreds of images a week, sometimes thousands, and yet I still don't want to get involved in the complexity of Lightroom. I don't need all that cataloging effort and the stuff that comes with it. If you decide you do, then check out parts 1 and 2, and part 3 will be coming to you pretty darn soon. So we're on page 3 of the notes. It says, what is RAW and why do I need it? Well, that's a good question. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm kind of reading this off of page 3, page 49 if you're in the book. I'm sorry, for those that have the book, I'm on page 49. What is RAW and why do I need it? A camera RAW file contains unprocessed, uncompressed 16-bit data from your digital camera. It's just information, but gobs and oodles of it. It isn't even really a file format. Okay, like JPEG or TIFF. It also doesn't even have a color space, which we talked about in class 5 about color spaces. You can't open a RAW file directly in Photoshop. You must first work with it in the Adobe Camera Raw ACR plugin before sending it to Photoshop. And or in the develop module, if that's the way you decide to go, when we talked about it up in this slide here. If you decide to do this, right here, ACR, and you're using the Lightroom Develop module, anytime I use ACR today, just substitute Lightroom Develop module. Remember, they're the same. You just want the same goals. I hope that makes sense. ACR is a separate program. It's technically called a plugin, just so you know, but it is linked to Photoshop. You cannot open a RAW file, like I said, directly into Photoshop. It opens automatically into ACR. Priscilla wants to know, do you create a duplicate first before going into ACR? Yes, absolutely. We talked about that in part 1. And if you go to my workflow chart, the linear workflow chart that's in the book, or you can download it from the useful downloads link, that's one of the first things I suggest you do is you duplicate your original and work on the copy. So that's actually a good question, Priscilla. So yeah, I never do work on the original. Shooting RAW plus JPEG, got this here just a little bit. If your camera has the option of shooting RAW plus JPEG, then you should do so. It takes up little in memory and gives you a quick look-see image that's been processed for contrast, color, and so on, although it's been decided by a computer chip. And if you got your JPEG and your RAW side by side and the library module, Lightroom, or in Bridge, or anything like that, people will say, oh, my JPEG looks better. No. You have not even started to work on your RAW file. So don't believe your eyes until you've actually opened it up in ACR and worked on it properly, or in Develop module. Next thing I want to talk about is tonal compression. And this is also on page 3, page 49 in the book. I've just made a little illustration here to kind of explain it. This is the inevitable degradation of your original scene from your eyes to the print. It's pure physics. The range of colors reproduced shrinks throughout the process. There's not a thing you can do about it. All you can do is minimize it. I'll use my chart here. On page 3, I say, let's say our eyes see 100 shades red. Well, I'm going to change that a little bit. Let's say that This is a percentage number of what our eyes see in the visual spectrum, assuming we all have decent eyes. And, we definitely have better eyes than what a camera can see. So let's say we see 100% of all the visible spectrum in JPEG and in RAW both. Once we shoot it with a camera, JPEG, because it's 8-bit versus 16-bit, and we'll talk about that in a second, only captures about 40% of those values. Photoshop, when you bring it into Photoshop or any kind of program, whether it's Photoshop, Lightroom, and you do any kind of manipulation to it or enhancement, you're down to 30%. By the time you actually print it, you're down to 15% of your values. And let's look at RAW now. 100% is in the visual spectrum. When you shoot in RAW, you're capturing about 70% of what your eye sees. Photoshop only sees about 60% of that. And then what is actually printed is about 45%. So you can see that there's 3 times more information printed just by shooting RAW. Okay, I hope that tonal compression makes some sense. All we can do is minimize it. So how do we minimize it? And this is also on page 3, page 49 in the book, as well as on the screen. Minimize tonal compression, shooting RAW for the important stuff. Work in a proper color working space in Photoshop, which we talked about last week in class 5. And have your color management house in order, which we also talked about in class 5. Let's go on to the next page, which is page 4. RAW is different from a JPEG in 2 major aspects. There's a heck of a lot more information in RAW. In fact, there's so much information that some of it may not even be in the visible spectrum, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, is bringing information back into the visible spectrum. There is no automatic file compression and processing in RAW. It's just literally a whole bunch of information. 16-bit versus 8-bit, again on page 4, page 50 in the book, if you have the book. More information is a very good thing in photographic capture. So if you look at a JPEG, it has 17.7 million combinations of red, green, and blue. But a RAW file is going to have something like 281 trillion combinations of red, green, and blue pixels. Because 16-bit is not twice as big as an 8-bit. It's a magnitude bigger. It's a logarithmic function. It's saying the way that a 6.0 earthquake is twice as powerful as a 5.0 earthquake, not just 20% more powerful. So a 16-bit file is not twice as much information. It's hundreds of times more information. So you want to capture that information. Information is king when you're working with digital. An XMP file, unless you have a .dng file format, you're going to end up with a .xmp file. And the XMP file is a separate file that contains instructions for your RAW file. And by the way, it talks about it on page 4, page 50 in the book. You never open the .xmp file. In fact, it's only created as soon as you make any modifications to your RAW file. It is also saved in the same folder as your RAW file. It just kind of sits there, but if you end up transferring your massaged RAW file for backup, make sure and transfer your .xmp also. And it talks about that at the bottom of page 4. Let's go to page 5. This could be, page 5 could be the most important page probably in what we're going to discuss today. By the way, if you see anything with a box around it in my notes, it's probably pretty darn important. So take advantage of the strengths of each program. It says what to do in RAW. I spend about 25 to 30% of my total time in RAW. And what I want to do, I make as many global hue, saturation, and brightness corrections following the goals that I can. And again, those goals are coming up next. So, pay attention to them, because that's probably the most important thing. What to do in Photoshop after you brought it into RAW. I do all of my contrast adjustments, fine-tune global corrections, all local corrections, cloning, straightening, horizon, etc. Cropping, resizing, sharpening. There are much better tools in Photoshop to do that than there are in RAW. And to me, a master file should not be cropped or resized or anything anyway. Remember our visual representation, it comes in the right-hand side of the flowchart, the visual flowchart we showed. So the goals are to bring your final RAW image into Photoshop, and these are listed on page 5, page 51 in the book. The 4 goals are to bring your final RAW image into Photoshop, Number one, slightly oversaturated because it's always easier to saturate in Photoshop. Slightly low or flat in contrast because it's always easier to increase your contrast in Photoshop. Slightly underexposed because it's always easier to lighten. At best overall color balance. You can fine tune your individual areas in Photoshop. As a good example, this last of the 4 goals, if you've got an image where the foreground looks great, but your sky has a cyanish cast to it, color correct overall for the foreground, and then come in, isolate the sky with the layer mask, and you can change the hue of the sky so that it isn't quite so, let's say, cyan. Why these 4 goals, you would ask? Well, it brings lots of digital information into the visible spectrum for your master file. Further, it provides headroom or a margin of error. It's always better to have more information than not enough, and information is king in post-processing. Those that know me know I'm also a drummer and have been for about 50 years. So I've played in a lot of different bands. And in fact, the analogy that I mentioned here actually applies to music also, because if you're in a live environment and hearing the music, that's 100% of the audible signal. But then as soon as you bring it into a microphone, it gets cut down. It brings into a recording device, tape recorder, digital recorder, loses some. Again, it's the physical properties. In that case, audio tonal compression, where your final output is based on the quality of your speakers and the quality of your input. This is also the same, and I talk about headroom for that very reason. Bands, rock and roll, whatever, tend to do a sound check before anybody comes in, and they want to make it louder than they expect with no feedback. That way, they know that if they need to crank it a little bit because people in the audience are soaking up the sound, they can do so without it feeding back. So that's essentially what we're doing here, is we want to create a headroom by using these 4 goals. In the box at the bottom on page 5, page 51 in the book, the overall goal is not to make a perfect image in ACR, which is what most people try to do, including Lightroom users in the develop module, and you simply can't. By using these goals, you'll take advantage of the strengths of both ACR and Photoshop in your overall workflow to end up with your final desired killer image via your master file. So what are those strengths of each program? The strengths of Adobe Camera Raw is to maximize that digital information, to bring it into the visible spectrum. The strength of Photoshop is to maximize the use of that information after you bring it all into the visible spectrum. And I am now actually on page 6 and page 52 in the book. There are actually quite a few advanced tools in the ACR plugin as well as the develop module. However, both in the workflow and the spirit of KISS, keeping it super simple, you should not be using the more advanced functions. It's quite possible that you, like me, will never use them. And I don't. I hardly ever use them. I just use the basic stuff. I want to keep it simple. I also never and this goes right in what I'm talking about here, is I never use any of the various tools and brushes in Adobe Camera Raw. There's not a history panel. There are no layers in ACR, and Photoshop does a much better job of doing what most of these gee whiz functions in ACR do, to be perfectly honest with you. And I already mentioned this, that you should strike a balance between the amount of time that you spend in ACR versus Photoshop. And the more time you spend in ACR, the less time you're probably going to spend in Photoshop, and vice versa. So if you bring pixels into the visible spectrum, then you're going to be exposing to the left, essentially, and you should be anyway. If you're not familiar with that phrase, I would urge you to Google expose to the left and look at the various thoughts on exposing to the left in your histogram, exposing to the right. The histogram you see on page 6 is exposed to the left, where the majority of pixels are to the left side of the middle of the histogram. So that's what we want to do. You want it slightly underexposed with plenty of headroom or room for adjustment, particularly in the highlights. You're basically bringing pixels from your raw capture into the visible spectrum. Now, once you are done with RAW and you press the open button, here 3 things will happen, and you'll hear me refer to these a lot. One is Adobe Camera Raw will close, your file opens in Photoshop, and a .xmp file is created in the same folder where your original RAW file is. And we talked about XMP files just a little bit. I'm going to show you this in Photoshop, but there is kind of an evolution of the file name. When you first open your file in Photoshop, as I show in step 2 up here, the file name in the document window may still say .nef or .cr2 or .arw. It's not. It really is kind of a hybrid TIFF, but this will make more sense when we get into Photoshop, which we'll open here in just a second. Okay, let's go to the next page, which is page 7. I'm going to leave this to you folks because at page 53 in the book, because we don't have any non-raw files that we're going to work on tonight. Everything we have, the 7 files we're going to work on, are all raw files. But if you look at my workflow chart, I run everything through either Adobe Camera Raw plugin or a filter that's built into Photoshop called the Camera Raw filter. And it works for your non-raw files, such as JPEG, TIFF, and so on. I do, if I have a JPEG or a TIFF that I'm starting with, instead I will employ a non-raw workflow, particularly for problem files. And it's amazing how much more you can improve your non-raw files by doing this. So you're the same goals, but here's how you physically do it. And I'll let y'all look at that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. We're almost done. We can open up in Photoshop in here in just a second. I just want to show you the evolution, if you will, from the original raw files, which you'll see on the left here, what the optimized file will look like in ACR. All right, and both of these meet those goals. Then when we bring it into Photoshop, we got all sorts of information to work with. And I'll show you how when we open in Photoshop, how you know by looking at your histogram that you're bringing that information in to work with. By the way, what you see here on the screen, if you go to your notes, I'm not going to, but you can see these side by side and bigger on page 14 and 15 of the notes, page 61 and 62 in the book, and these are just visual examples of the goals of RAW and how they're applied. Let's go to the next slide. Those that know me know I'm also a disciple, little d by the way, not religious, of the great Hsl Adjustments, especially from a post-processing perspective. And I'm old school. You can tell by my picture that with the loss of hair comes extreme knowledge and wisdom, but it also means that I'm old school. The old school would say, okay, you got analog capture, you process your negative, and you print. And when you expose for highlights and process for your shadow detail. So I kind of love to follow those 4 goals to process my originals digitally. So let's look at this very famous image from Hsl Adjustments. This is a picture of the original black and white negative that he shot of Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. And we've all seen this image, the one in the bottom right corner. But that's the original negative. You're going, what? Okay, there's just not a whole bunch there. But you'll notice when he does a contact sheet, okay, we've got detail in the shadow. And if we were to expose in our print for the highlights, we'd probably have a pretty nifty image, but everything else would be too dark. So in fact, here is the original initial contact print in the bottom left-hand corner. And you can see it's okay, right? Okay, well, this is Hsl Adjustments. And you can see what he was able to do with the information that was in that original negative. And when we did the processing back in the day, you use a whole different, particularly for black and white, there were dozens of different kinds of chemistries and developers and mixtures that you could use to flatten your negative out, to reduce the contrast, and to bring all that into the visible spectrum on your negative. And so that's essentially what we're doing here, is the same kind of thing. So now, of course, using the 4 goals, I'm doing the same thing. Instead of using a negative with RAW, just think of RAW as our developer, if you will. It's called Develop Module in the Lightroom for a reason, I'll bet. So as to get as much information as possible into the visible spectrum for printing purposes, I'll follow those 4 goals. So now that flow, instead of being analog capture, it's now digital capture. And instead of processing negatives, we have RAW plus Photoshop. And then, of course, we take it to the printer from there. So I hope that kind of makes sense on where we're headed here tonight. Well, let's go to page 8 in the notes, page 55 if you're in the book, and we'll go ahead and open Photoshop. Okay, there's Adobe Camera Raw. You'll notice that behind there is Photoshop. When I open a raw file, and this raw file is a .nef, which means it's a Nikon, it's an older file, it opens Adobe Camera Raw plugin. There's a couple things you'll want to do to set your preferences, and then I'm going to kind of go around the horn clockwise and show you what all these functions are. First thing let's start with is to set your preferences. There's a preference menu right up here, and you want to apply sharpening to preview images only, not all images. The reason you want to do that is because the sharpening algorithm that's built into Adobe Camera Raw is vastly inferior to the sharpening methods that you can use in Photoshop. So that's not something you want to do. And besides, you don't want to sharpen your master file at all. So just leave apply sharpening to preview images only. And once you do that, you can click OK, and you're done with the preferences. In the workflow options menu, which is down here at the bottom, you'll want to click this. There are 4 things you'll want to check, and it's listed on page 855 of the book. You want to choose your color space. I suggest, as I did last week, Adobe RGB. Bit depth, 16 bits per channel. No use don't even bother if you're doing this in 8 bits. It's better to bring everything along in 16-bit as long as you can. Image sizing, just leave it at the default. Don't do any enlarging or reducing in size in Adobe Camera Raw. Again, there's much better options in Photoshop. And then 300 pixels per inch. As we talked about last time, there aren't any printers out there that can really print anything higher than 300 pixels per inch. Not talking about dots per inch, DPI, which is the amount of ink that's laid down on paper if you're using inkjet printer. I'm talking about in your digital file. Anything more than 300, your eyes can't resolve it. So make your master files, as well as when you're working in RAW, which is the start of your master file, of course, leave it at 300. So I'll go ahead and click that. And if you have more than one camera body, or like me, you get multiple files from different folks, I would check this workflow options at the bottom on a regular basis. It's sticky, but only if you have one camera, and it might be sticky to 2 cameras after a while, but it's just a good habit to get into. I mean, I've gone in and done a bunch of work and realized, oh my goodness, it's only at 200 PPI or 240 or something. So you'll want to check that if you're using different camera bodies or from another person's camera. Otherwise, that is a pretty sticky function, and you should only have to do that once. But it's a good idea to kind of just keep an eye on them. So I'm going to I'm now on page 9, and that's page 56 in the book. A couple of quick features here. This list is far from complete, but I'm just going to give you some basics here. I'm going to start clockwise from the upper left and work my way around. And some of these I'll cover as we go along. First of all, across this top toolbar, I wouldn't use anything here unless it's like, oh, you want to change the horizontal or vertical orientation. That's a good way to do it. I would not use any of these gee whiz buttons and what have you that you find here. The only thing I ever check is usually by default, it's the zoom tool. So if I'm in the workspace and I click on this image with my mouse, it enlarges whether I wanted to or not. So what I like to do is I like to put it on the hand tool instead, because I can press it down and it's not going to zoom in or out. And also all of the basic speed keys do work on this. And those that know me, I have what I consider 10 essential speed keys, and 3 of them are this: Command 0, Command minus, and Command plus, or Control 0, Control minus, and Control plus. If I go Command 0, Control 0 on a PC, it will fill the screen. If I go Control minus on a PC, Command minus on a Mac, then it will reduce the size. Control plus or Command plus on a Mac, and it will enlarge it. So I'm going to go back to Command 0. And since I've chosen the hand tool, not only is it easier to see, but I can press it down all I want and it's not going to zoom in or out. If I wanted to, I can use those speed keys. And by the way, I don't have this listed, but there is a post called the 10 essential speed keys in Photoshop or something like that. And like I said, not everybody's as excited about speed keys as I am, but I think that there are 10, including these 3 and Command S or Control S when you're saving your file. And a lot of these, by the way, might transfer to other programs, like Command Z to back up a step. That works in just about any program. Let's go ahead and move them clockwise. This right here, I like, and we talked about this last class 5, about distractions, perception and your lighting. And one of the things, if I don't press this toggle full screen mode, you can see how there's stuff in the background, and particularly if your screen is smaller like this. Well, to me, that's very distracting. So I love toggling into the full screen mode. That way I'm looking just at the Adobe Camera Raw and nothing else. Going around the horn here again, these are clipping warnings, and clipping is defined as the unwanted elimination of pixels. And so we want to know if there's any clipping going on. There's very little clipping going on in this particular image. I'm going to turn them on. You can see if I turn them on, a little black box comes on, and same here. So if you look in the image, and I will use Command++ so you can kind of see, this is a very minor example. There's some highlight clipping there, which we'll get rid of. And then there's also somewhere, maybe not much. No, there's hardly any black clipping, or if there is, I can't see it, but the histogram says there is, but it doesn't make any difference. What we want to do is we want to avoid clipping at all possible. That's part of that 4 goals, is to bring that information back into the visible spectrum. There's probably information for this corner in the upper left hand where it's light, but we need to reach into our bucket of raw and bring it back into the visible spectrum. So again, we have a histogram. We also have an informational little area, which is kind of nice. Tells you the ISO, the lens that's used, all that good stuff. The next thing going clockwise is we have a whole series of tabs here. I don't even know how many there are. There's really only 4 that you're going to use on a regular basis, maybe 3. By default, it's on the basic tab. That's the one we're all used to seeing. And you can see if I hover my mouse over the tab, it will tell me which one it is. The detail tab, if we do any noise reduction, that's where we would do it. And then the other one is the lens correction tab. So there are 4. I take that back. The 4th would be Hsl Adjustments. Now, y'all that were here 2 weeks ago for class 2, control your contrast and color, we talked about using the Hue saturation adjustment layer. That's essentially what this tab does here, where we can fine tune with a scalpel rather than a hatchet, changing individual colors. Because when we change our colors here in the basic tab, it's a global color correction. Let me keep going. We're going to come back and I'll spend a lot of time on the basic tab as we go along. On the bottom right-hand side here, we have the open image button. After I've made adjustments to the image, the desired adjustments to the image, if I hit open image, then again, those 3 things that I mentioned earlier will happen. Adobe Camera Raw will close, your image will open in Photoshop, and a .xmp file is generated and saved in the same folder as your raw file. Let's keep going. Oh, if you hit cancel, anything that you've done to your image will not be saved. If you don't want to open it in Photoshop right now, but you like the work that you've done to it, honey, it's time to come to dinner, or something like that, and this is a good stopping point, just hit the done. It will do 2 of those 3 things that we talked about. It will close ACR, and an XMP file is generated. When you're ready to open that image and then eventually transfer it to Photoshop or open it in Photoshop, you would open the raw file again in Photoshop, and of course it automatically opens ACR, and all the corrections that you made are still there. Rarely are you going to need done, but I just want you to know what it is. But 99% of the time, after you made all these corrections we're going to talk about, met those 4 goals, we'll hit open image. Some more information. Oh, right here. This is, let me make a change and you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, there's a change. There's 4 buttons here, and the other 3 to the left are kind of silly in my regard, but one of the main one here is the preview toggle. And this toggle here, if I click it on and off, it will show me before and after. So there's before and there's after. Also, this toggle is tab dependent. So if I'm making adjustments, let's say in Hue saturation, okay, then it will only be, that preview toggle will only work for the tab that you have open. So let's go back to this. See, I think, the name of the file on the camera that it was shot is down here on the left. You can zoom in and out with all this here on the left. To be perfectly honest with you, I like the Command+, Command-, and Command 0, or Control+, -0 to zoom in and out on my image. I find that a lot easier than using what we're talking about here. Cynthia asked, will the adjustments in ACR, are they destructive if you click done? No, actually, it's the other way around. It will be less destructive because you're bringing more information. You're throwing out less pixels. I think that'll make more sense when we go along, but no, it is not destructive. Okay, so that being the case, let's see. We're going to come back to page 9. It was the only place I had room for it to put in the notes. This is the raw overall workflow checklist. If you have the workflow chart, the linear workflow chart from my book, it's on page F. If you have the workflow chart downloaded from my useful download webpage, it's also built in. This checklist is built into the overall Photoshop workflow chart. So I'm going to come back to page 9. Let's go to page 10, page 57 if you're in the book. So what we're going to do here, I talked about the clipping warnings, and that's what they're talking about here on page 10. And there's some shortcuts to toggle the clipping on and off if you want. Generally, I just leave them on as you see them here in the upper right-hand corner. If you turn them off, then you can see they're not depressed. The rest of this, really, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through this without really going through the notes. But I'm generally going to be on page 10 and 11 and 12. A couple things to cover. I think we've covered most of the important stuff on 10. We just want to turn the clipping warnings on and bring as much information back in to the visible spectrum that we can. You'll notice too on page 11, page 58 in the book, highlight clipping is typically shown in red, like I showed you up here, and shadow clipping is typically shown in blue, very similar to the samples on clipping and levels. I'm going to keep going. We'll come back to this. And like I mentioned here on page 11, there's a whole series of tabs, and there's really 4 that I work on a regular basis. The basic tab is the default tab when ACR opens, and it's where you're going to do the vast majority of your work in ACR by moving these adjustment sliders. And it's important to have it. Well, you'll notice that there's 4 sections, and there's a horizontal line. There's one right here. There's a gray line right here and a gray line right here. So it's divided into 1, 2, 3, 4. By the way, anything that you see up here where it says treatment, color, black and white, profile, Adobe color, just leave them alone. It's more gee-whiz stuff you really don't need, want, or desire. You'll notice that they're conveniently grouped into 4 sections, if you will. There's a color balance group up top. There's an exposure contrast group, and an edge sharpness group, and a color intensity group. Now, you'll recall that from our discussion of workflow that you want to adjust your contrast and brightness first before you adjust your color. If you adjust your contrast and brightness and adjust your color, it's probably not going to throw your contrast and brightness out. But if you adjust your color first and then adjust your contrast and brightness, it's probably going to throw your colors out. So that being the case, I always recommend, and this is on page 11, that you start by adjusting the exposure contrast group first, okay? I'm going to start with my exposure. Now, the 4 goals, if you recall, okay, were darker, less contrasty, slightly oversaturated, and overall best color balance. So the first thing I'm going to do is I got a highlight slider and a white slider. And by the way, you'll notice each one of these sliders, it'll show you what it's going to do. So if I move this slider to the left, it darkens it. If I move it to the right, it lightens it, so on and so forth. So I want to reduce the highlights, which are between midtones and your whites and or whites. So I'm going to start with the highlights. Now, first of all, notice my histogram's kind of spread all over the place. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and reduce my highlights, and I'm also going to reduce my whites. And it just happens on this particular image, I'm going to reduce it 100%. Now, if you look up here in the upper left-hand corner, if I use the preview toggle on this tab, you can see before and after. So already, just by reducing my highlights and whites, I have lowered my contrast. Does that make sense? Now I brought stuff back in to the visible spectrum. Now I could try opening shadows. I already did a little bit. Doesn't really make much. Oh, I guess it does. Here's without and here's with. Now I also want it slightly darker. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. By the way, there's a couple things I almost never touch. One is the contrast slider, and if it is not to increase the contrast, it's to decrease the contrast. And you'll see some examples of that tonight. I also never touch. We'll talk about the edge sharpness group down here. I never touch clarity and dehaze for a number of reasons. You can think of texture as fine edge sharpening, clarity as medium edge sharpening, and dehaze as coarse edge sharpening. Well, all we want to do with the edge sharpening is just add enough to overcome the failure of digital capture. We don't want to do anything else. And edge sharpening, by the way, increases drastically your contrast. That's another reason we don't use the clarity and dehaze. There are much better ways to do it. So let's look at the color. Now, you recall in class 2, we talked about looking for neutrals. We got the aspen tree, we got the dirt, we got this rock. All of it's too blue. So I'm going to warm the slider up now that we've got I think we got our contrast and brightness the way we want it. And you can see that that's helping. But now when I move the slider to the right to add yellow to it, it's adding some magenta into this. So I want to bring this slider over just a little bit. And by the way, I'm just doing a coarse adjustment. I can also click, like all of these, into the box and use my up and down arrows to fine tune if I need. So I'm going to use the before and after. There's before and there's after. One of the things I automatically do, and it talks about this in the notes, is I usually add about 10 units of texture and virtually no more. I mean, you don't need any more. Your sharpening, heavy duty sharpening, should be done in Photoshop. If you do use the clarity and dehaze tool, you're increasing the contrast tremendously. You're really not adding anything to sharpness. And besides, by increasing the contrast, you're defeating one of those 4 goals we talked about. Now, I'm also, it's not unusual for me to add a lot of vibrance. I almost never use saturation slider. I really like the vibrance tool, and 30 or so is not unusual. So here's before, and there's after. I can actually add a little more yellow to this. I'm still looking at the trees here just a little bit. There we go. Now that meets pretty much 4 of our 4 goals. It's slightly oversaturated, it's low in contrast, it's slightly dark, and it is the best overall color balance, except for these yellow leaves are not yellow, they're orange. So if I go to use saturation, which is the 4th one over, then I can take the oranges and make it a little, well, actually, let's change to U and make it more yellow, and you can see what that does. Now remember, the preview toggle only works for the tab that we're in, which is the Hsl Adjustments. So here's before, and you can see right here, all of this is orange, and now that orange is more yellow. Okay. Priscilla, that's a good question. She asks, is the ultimate goal to have the histogram more to the left, or is that in Photoshop outcome? No, that should be, depending on your subject, it should be in RAW. I hope that makes sense. We want to get as much information as we can, particularly on the highlight end of this. Now, there is some blue clipping here. If I really wanted to try to get rid of that, I could probably go to the black slider and slide that. Now, not really. I wouldn't even worry about something like that. So now you can see that we met those 4 requirements. As soon as I hit open image, the 3 things that I talked about will happen. First is that ACR closes, the image opens in Photoshop, and then the third thing is it saves a .xmp file. You have to take my word for it on that one. Here's where I was talking about the file evolution name. It says it's a .nef, but it's not. One of the very first things I do is I will automatically save this image as a PSD and put an _M, capital M, as my master file, okay? That means that's the one I'm going to actually do any work on in Photoshop. Now, if you want to see what I'm going to do with the image, that was part of class 2, control your contrast and color. Plus, in class 4, we're going to talk about that a lot. We're actually going to take 7 or 8 of your images and go all the way through that workflow chart from Adobe Camera Raw all the way, well, we're not going to crop, but just to get it to the master file portion. Okay, this is John's image. When we look at this, we want to know, okay, what do we want to do to this? Now, we want to satisfy those 4 goals. Now, when we look at this, yes, you can see that the histogram is really kind of blocked up against the left-hand side, which means it's just probably way too dark. So the first thing I'm going to do, again, actually, if you go to page 9, in fact, I should be doing that. Page 9 has the raw overall workflow checklist, and I didn't even do one of these steps, which is to adjust the lens correction. So let's go to that first. And so I'm going to, before I do anything else, I'm going to click on the lens correction tab. That's step 1 in my raw workflow checklist. I will click remove chromatic or aberration and enable profile corrections. And this is somewhere in those notes in the end pages, just so you know. By the way, John, this is a really, really good lens, because look at the difference. Here's before, and the lens correction not only straightened the parallax, but it opened up the darkness, the falling off of the corners, which really isn't anything you did. You shot this at, it looks like a 35 millimeter lens. That's a really, really, really nice lens. So that being the case, adding that profile correction made a big difference. Step 3 in our overall workflow checklist for RAW says to adjust the basic tab, exposure and contrast first, then color. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually lighten it up a little bit, maybe just a little bit dark. But now we're not seeing any details in the dress. So I want to open up the shadows, which we did a little bit last time, but not as much. There we go. I may open this up even a little more. Okay, I don't think we need to bring down the highlights or the whites, because as you can see in our histogram, there's really not much of a difference. In fact, watch the histogram. Here's before and here's after. You can see how much more we're bringing into this. Color-wise, it actually looks pretty darn good too. I don't think I'd do anything to that. I would definitely add 10 units of texture. And I would definitely kick the vibrance up. If we think it's too red, and I believe, John, you mentioned something about the background being too bright. Well, we can tone that down in Photoshop. That's easy, because, of course, the main subject is the woman in the red dress. Actually, this may be a case where I'm going to actually delete the contrast, because I want to get more detail in this dress. So I'm going to delete the contrast. Look at there. And then actually, I think I can leave that alone. There's before and after. Using the lens correction, that meets I believe our 4 goals. I don't think we need to go in to use saturation and fine tune anything in here. So the 4 goals were slightly oversaturated, definitely that. It is slightly dark, it's low in contrast, and it's got best overall color balance without a doubt. Her skin tones look good. If we did anything, we might add just a smidge. I'm gonna click in here in this box up here on the color and just give it a little punch here. Just a little. That's not bad. So here's what we started with, and here's what we ended up with. Now, if I open image, which is what I'm going to do here, because I've met our 4 goals, it brings it into Photoshop. Again, the 3 things that we talked about happen, where it will close Adobe Camera Raw, it will create a .xmp file, and it will also open in Photoshop. Now, again, it says .arw because that's the file designation for a RAW file and I believe a Sony camera. So just to give you an idea of the difference we've made just by doing that. This is from class 2. Watch what happens to the overall pop on this thing. And there's absolutely no way we could have gotten that kind of pop if we had not brought that information into Adobe Camera Raw from the visible spectrum. John, does that make sense? And I'll go ahead and save that just so you can kind of see what I did as a PSD, and I'll put an underscore capital M, because that would be the beginning of your master file. Let's go with our next image here, which is Georgia Mary Peterson's. Well, you can see where this one's going. Our sky's way too light and our foreground's way too dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first do from our chart on page 9 or page 56. Well, it's not on page 56 in the book. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and check the lens correction, see if there is any. Oh, yeah, big difference. Again, you can see by enabling the lens profile correction, the lens profile correction, that it will get rid of some of this vignetting in the corners, and again, kind of pops to the parallax just a little bit. Next thing we'll do is go to the basic tab. Obviously, we want to open up our shadows, and obviously we want to bring down our highlights. And I'm going to bring down both whites and highlights and open up the shadows. In fact, all 3 of those that are 100%. Now, when I do, you see how there's a little bit of a halo here? That means that we overdid it with the shadows. So I'm going to back off. We overdid it with one of these, either highlights or whites or shadows. So I want to back off just a little bit so that we don't have near as much of a halo. But that being said, now I can make it darker and I can decrease the contrast. Now let's watch this histogram up here in the upper right-hand corner. Here's before. And all this information on the outside It's starting to clip, even though there's not, well, there's a little clipping warning in the shadow area underneath the rock. But what we've done is we've looked at our histogram, we looked at our image, and we've flattened it out contrast-wise. We've increased, in fact, I'll go ahead and kick the vibrance up, and then maybe 10 units of texture. The color, I don't know, we really need to do anything to it, although I bet a little yellow wouldn't hurt. I'm looking at this rock, it's got a little bit of a bluish cast to it. Oh yeah, that actually helps a little bit on the sky. Now in this particular image, just so you know, I would split this up into zones when we opened in Photoshop and work on levels and hue saturation in the sky separate from levels and hue saturation in the foreground and the rock. But you can see the difference before, and again, you can see the histogram in the upper right-hand corner. There's before, and there's after. Okay. Does that make sense, George, Mary? That makes sense? Nice image, by the way. And let's see here. And I'll save that again as a Photoshop PSD. It's got the _M for the master file. And now I can start to work on it. Even if I just did, you know, a basic global levels, you'll see the difference that it makes. There's the clipping in the sky, starting to throw out some of that color. And we talked about the clipping using the Option key or the Alt key. And already you can see a big difference between before and after. So there was a raw file that they knew the color was there when they shot it. So fortunately, because they shot it raw, we were able to bring it back in. All right, let's go to the next one here. Okay, Chris, this one will be yours. And we got a whole bunch of challenges with this one for some reason, but that's okay. It's a tough exposure. They're in the shadow, and so is the sign. And the sky is kind of washed out. So, and it's also got a real bluish cast. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the lens correction, remove chromatic or aberration. I do always. Do I always use the lens profile? Not always, but most of the time it works really well. Like I'm going to go ahead and do it because it's kind of, you know, evening things out here a little bit in the corners a little bit. Generally speaking, yeah, you're going to use it. If you're using a fisheye lens and you use the profile correction, you're probably not going to be happy with the results because it's going to try to straighten everything. And one of the things about fisheye lenses is it has that really cool distortion. So generally speaking, you will use the enable profile corrections. But if you don't use it, don't worry about it. It's not anything wrong with not using it. Okay, you see our histogram. Let's go to the basic tab. First, we got a whole bunch of stuff in the background. You can see it in the histogram, and you can see it here. I'm going to go ahead and bring down those highlights. I'm going to bring them down all the way because this is pretty hot in the background. And I'm going to bring it down the whites. I'm going to do the same thing. Let's see what happens when I open the shadow area. Oh, yeah, much better. Maybe, yeah, I'll go ahead and do both of those, both all the way, and bring the overall exposure down. Maybe decrease the contrast a little bit so that we flatten this thing. Now, if we correct for the bluish cast in the gate here that's hanging up the sign, or the post that's hanging up the sign, it really helps the whole image. It brings some nifty colors into the sky, and a little pink, so we'll do something like that. And I'll definitely add about 30% or so, or 30 units of vibrance. We can always desaturate if we don't like it, but I'd sure like to get a lot more green out of that grass. And then the 10 units of texture that I talk about. So here's before, and again, you can see it in the histogram. Here's before, and here it is after, where we've met our 4 goals. Slightly oversaturated, low in contrast, slightly dark, and best overall color balance. And we could probably even add a little more yellow to this. I don't want the sky to get so yellow that it gets unrealistic, so it may have to be that you would split the sky into one zone and do the levels and hue saturation on that, and then another zone on everything else, including the folks in front here. So as soon as I hit open image, it opens in Photoshop, it closes ACR, and it still says this until we, the .cr2, which is a Canon designation for a raw file. And the third is it does create a .xmp file. So at that point, that one, I'm gonna go ahead and save that one. Okay, Patricia, this one will be yours. And you can already see that with the clipping warning, we're getting some clipping down in here. Normally, I would look for noise in these areas, but I'm not going to because it has a low ISO. So chances are, by the time we open up these shadows in a second, which you'll see it'll make a big difference. First thing I want to do is go to the lens correction tab. Again, I'm on this workflow chart checklist on page 9. And I'm going to definitely remove chromatic aberrations, and I'm going to see what happens with this. Okay, it's built in, so I'm not sure if that's just the way the lens is or whatever. You can see when I enable it, it's not giving us one, so it's not worth bothering with. Second thing is we'll go to adjust the basic tab. First thing I'm going to do, of course, is I'm going to open the shadows all the way. I love the glow on this guy. Look at that cool. And then I'll reduce the highlights, the storm effect, because that's one of the things that makes this image so neat. I'll reduce the contrast, and I might even actually lighten it up a little bit. We don't want it so dark it's hard to work with. And again, I reduce the contrast a little bit to make things a lot easier for us. Color-wise, again, I don't know that I would change. You'll notice, and I think I pointed this out the last time I did that master file and creation class, I don't usually have to worry about the color a whole bunch unless it's like that sign that had the posts where there was obviously a bluish bias to it, or the very first one I showed you with the yellow trees, the aspen trees. That kind of thing, obviously, that's where you want to bring in the color balance. But in an image like this, I don't know that I necessarily would. This looks pretty cool. So here's before and after. Oh, let me add some vibrance. I'll give it 10 units of texture. Okay, here's before and after. We'll look at our histogram again. You can see what I'm talking about. There's before, and there's after. Before and after. So it meets our 4 goals. It's definitely less contrasty than it was. It is slightly oversaturated. It is slightly dark, and best overall color balance. In fact, I love the color balance over. I don't know that I would change this one at all. The only thing I might do is isolate maybe his face and some of this area down in his chest and below, just to lighten it up just a little bit. There's still a little bit of clipping going on in there. Let me see how much noise we've got. Yeah, there is a bit of noise in there too, because of the extremity in exposure. And so this one would probably need to be run through something like Topaz or what have you. Okay, I'll go ahead and hit open image, and let me save that. And again, I'll save it as _M for master file, and I'm saving it as a Photoshop master file. And this is for Larry Strickland. I believe this is used. Chris, no, I would not use the dehaze at all. I would not use these 2 sliders, clarity and dehaze. I would only use texture and no more than 10. Like I said, there's 3 sliders on here I almost never use. Well, I virtually never use the clarity or dehaze because they increase the contrast, which is against what we're trying to do anyway. And they can have a tendency to over sharpen, and you get halos if you're not careful. The texture, by adding 10 units to the image, will take care of that failure of digital capture without using the other 2. The 3rd slider, by the way, that I hardly ever use is saturation. And if I use the 4th slider that I use with reservations is contrast, but only to decrease the contrast, not increase. So again, I want to flatten that contrast out. By using the clarity and dehaze slider, we're defeating those. Those are kind of, I like to call them gee whiz buttons, because if you never get out of the develop module in Lightroom, you think that's all there is to making your image look great, and it's not. It's only part of the process. Again, go back to what I said about Photoshop versus Lightroom. Okay, let's go to this one. First things first, we'll go to the chromatic aberration and profile corrections, and that made a big difference. You can see how it kind of straightened our verticals, made the tree a lot more straight, got rid of the dark corners, which if we want them, we'll add them ourselves. So now we'll go to this tab here. The highlights, will reduce the highlights, definitely bring some more information back in this and in the rocks and the whites. And I definitely want to open up some of this shadow detail. So I'll do that. And now I think it's just a little light. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the exposure down a little bit, maybe reduce the contrast just a little bit. By the way, if I reduce the contrast, I usually have to reduce the exposure also. So for some reason, they seem to be kind of tied hand in hand. And color-wise, Well, our rocks have a little bit of blue in it, so without making the sky yellow, we can certainly add a little bit, and even the green looks a little blue-green. So we'll go with something like that. We'll definitely kick the vibrance up. Oh yeah, see what a difference it makes in the sky. See, here's before. You can see the histogram, and here's after. And that meets our 4 requirements. It's slightly oversaturated. It's definitely lower in contrast, slightly dark, and it's got a real good overall color balance to begin with. So I'll go ahead and hit Open Image. It opens in Photoshop. It will close ACR and create a .xmp file for me. So let me save that one. Oh, and I shouldn't. Well, let me go ahead and save it first. Larry, on your image, I would probably split this into zones of the blue sky and pretty much everything else. Okay. Any other questions on that image? I'm going to try to get 2 more here. So let me start with Priscilla's, and then I want to end up with Bill Mittendorf's. Okay, let's go to the lens correction on this one here. Chromatic aberration, profile corrections, it's built in, so it doesn't make a difference. We'll leave that off. I'll go here. The first thing we want to do is we definitely want to reduce the highlights in here. It's actually not a bad exposure. You can look at the histogram. All we're going to really do is just kind of fine tune it a little bit. But if I bring down those highlights, see how we're getting all sorts of nifty color in here? Very nice. And I can open up the shadow area a little bit only because I want to make sure there's enough shadow detail in the artwork itself. Chances are we're going to split this into 2 zones and darken everything else or burn everything else down. So I'm going to go ahead and add the 10 units of texture and definitely add the vibrance. Now on this one, I really want to see if I can get a little more yellow out of this little spot here. So I'm going to go to the Hue Saturation tab, and I'm going to increase the saturation on the yellows. There we go. So here's before. You can watch this area right here. And there's after. Remember, the preview toggle only works for the tab that you're in. So we're in the Hsl Adjustments tab. So if I go before, you can see that yellow is not there. When we go after, you can see I was able to punch more yellow into the statue. I'm just curious what would happen if we punch up the aqua too. That may be too much. But you can kind of see if we had more time with that, we could probably bring a little more color into the statue itself. There's before and there's after. So I think that meets our 4 criteria, which would be slightly low in contrast. It would be slightly oversaturated. It's definitely a little bit on the dark side. We could actually go a unit or 2 darker. So I'm going to go into exposure. The exposure just for me tends to be for a mid-tone, and then I'll adjust my highlights and shadows with the appropriate sliders. Color looks good. I think that one's ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Open Image. And I'll go ahead and save that as my master file and work on that as we go. Now, on this particular image, there is no .xmp file saved for it because it was a DNG to begin with. And you may recall that with DNG, you don't get the XMP. The metadata is put into your file itself. So that is what that one looks like. Last one I want to do here. I'm going to do this in about 2 minutes, so hang on. I think you're going to like this. This is what I got from Bill. And as you can see, this has all sorts of possibilities, Bill. It really does. Obviously, and you can see the histogram. I'm going to reduce the highlights and the whites. I'm going to open up the shadow area. I'm going to do 100% on all 3 of those, highlights, shadows, and whites. Then I'm going to reduce the contrast. Then I'm going to reduce the exposure. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? My bad. Here. Let's see what the profile correction. Yeah, we'll leave the profile correction, and then I'll go back to the basic tab, and I'll bring that exposure down a little more. I'll bring the contrast down a little more and a little more. Now, when I'm looking at this, I'm picking up kind of a blue-green color in this. And maybe it is, but I'm going to assume it needs to be a little warmer. So I'm going to change the color and add a little yellow. And I'm going to add the vibrance. And of course, our 10 units of texture. And if you look at the histogram before and after, here's before. And there's after. No clipping. Everything's brought into the visual zone. There is, again, a little bit of clipping here, and I think it's down in this shadow area underneath the tree, but it's a minuscule part of the overall image compared to what else we have. And once that meets our requirements, if I hit open, then when it opens in Photoshop, we can go ahead, and I would split this one into zones for sure, and a little bit of cropping, and this would be a really, really nice image. Actually, Bill, and your exposure to the left, I would, if you have not put that down on your notes somewhere, I would Google that. I've thought about writing about that, but even if your exposure is tough like your trees are here, Bill, it still can quote unquote save you, if you will, because all we're doing is doing what Hsl did, and we're exposing or developing, if you will, our capture so that it brings everything into the visible spectrum. Okay, well, you get the idea. Couple things and we'll call it a night here. I'm running, 3 minutes late. I'm getting bad at this. Check out the homework, go through those links that we talked about. If you're using Lightroom or considering using Lightroom, go through that part 1 and part 2 of Photoshop versus Lightroom wrong question. I think there's a link on my on the links page to sign up for my Watts Digital mailing list. And I think that's pretty much it. All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.